Alex Traiman, you're the Jerusalem bureau chief for JNS News. Benny Gantz has just resigned from the war cabinet and the coalition. What does this mean for the government?
Well, Prime Minister Netanyahu still has a coalition of 64 members. This was the original coalition. Benny Gantz and his partner Gadi Eisenkot had joined just shortly after October 7th to create a unity government for Netanyahu. Gantz was Netanyahu's primary challenger in the previous election cycles, multiple election cycles, and wartime. It created a need for unity. And now Benny Gantz and Eisenkot have decided that the time for unity is over. It's back to the time for partisan politics. It's also pretty clear that Gantz has been colluding with Antony Blinken and the Biden administration. And Gantz had traveled to Washington about a month ago, or 2 months ago, rather, met with Blinken, met with Kamala Harris in the White House. The trip was specifically not authorized by the prime minister. Just 2 days after that trip, Chuck Schumer, one of the ranking senators in the United States, said that it was time for an Israeli election. And then, Benny Gantz a week later said it was time for an Israeli election. And now Gantz pulls out of the government 24 hours before Antony Blinken lands in Israel on another visit.
What would new elections mean for the government and Israel in the middle of a multi-front war?
Well, on the one hand, a new election would demonstrate who the people of Israel give the mandate to lead Israel during this period of crisis. On the other hand, in Israel, once you call an election, the existing government becomes a caretaker government until the time in which a new government is formed, which could be months after an election, and the election itself would be months away. So for a period of time, it could be half a year or more even, the government would be a caretaker government. And a caretaker government in Israel has less authority, less of a mandate than a full-fledged government. So it could hamstring the government, particularly in Israel, where the court and the attorney general tried to limit how much the government can actually do.
Would it make it more dangerous for Israel in the middle of this war?
Oh, I think so. And I actually think that in many ways, Gantz's resignation from the government, taking cues from the Biden administration and Antony Blinken, is meant to delegitimize Israel's government and the international community so that they could say that this is what they like to call a far-right extremist government, even though it's a center-right government. And also it's probably to try to prevent Netanyahu from expanding the war into southern Lebanon and to tackle Hezbollah, which has been just pummeling Israel over the last 8 months and even more so in the last several weeks. The Biden administration does not want Israel to go to war with Hezbollah in the lead up to the U.S. elections.
Yeah. Talk more about the U.S. involvement in Gantz's resignation. Is this the understanding of many Israelis here, that the U.S. is really trying to undermine the Netanyahu government?
Absolutely, and the Biden administration has not been shy about saying it. I mean, they've just repeatedly said, Netanyahu is the problem. Netanyahu and his right-wing coalition are the problem. Netanyahu has to go. Hillary Clinton said it. Chuck Schumer openly called for Netanyahu to face an election. The Biden administration has just made it very, very clear that they think that one of the major problems in this region is Benjamin Netanyahu, who's the man who's led Israel for the last 16 years, is known as a formidable statesman, helped to broker and sign the Abraham Accords, normalization agreements with the Emirates and Bahrain, has proven that he wants peace, has always avoided war, but now has no choice but to tackle Hamas and Hezbollah after they launched unprovoked attacks against the Jewish state.
How do most Israelis feel about Benjamin Netanyahu's handling of the war?
Well, it depends who you ask. For example, if you ask a lot of the reservists, and remember that Israel's military is mostly a civilian army, they look at the politicians and the upper echelons of the military, and they want this war to be fought with full force and to be won as quickly and decisively as possible. And there's a feeling that the political establishment, of which Gantz and Eisenkot were part of the war cabinet, have been hamstringing the efforts of the soldiers. In the beginning of the war, Netanyahu's ratings were down, and particularly in head-to-head comparisons against Gantz and others, Netanyahu was significantly lower. But in the most recent polls, even leading up to Gantz's resignation, Netanyahu has retaken the top spot in terms of popularity among Israelis of who they think is the most capable of being prime minister in this very challenging moment.
So can you expand on this? Despite the opposition by the U.S. government and Benny Gantz, even most Israelis really prefer Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, that's what the latest polls have indicated. And you've seen, since the beginning of the war, when Netanyahu's popularity dropped down to historically low levels, he's been slowly climbing back up in the polls. When Gantz entered the unity government, people saw him as a statesman-like alternative, someone who was putting the national good before his own political interests by joining his opponent to create a unity government. But now that Gantz is leaving the unity government, it's becoming clear to many Israelis that Gantz is just an opportunist and is throwing this whole concept of unity out the window, even while he continues to preach for unity.
Yeah. What does this mean for the war cabinet? My understanding is that you have Netanyahu, Gantz was there, and Gallant. Was Eisenkot part of the war cabinet too? And what does Gantz's resignation mean to the war cabinet?
Yeah, there was a 5-member war cabinet, and that included Netanyahu and the defense minister, Yoav Gallant, who's a member of Netanyahu's Likud party. Also, Minister of Strategic Affairs Ron Dermer as an observer. Gantz was a full member of the cabinet, as well as Gadi Eisenkot, who was an observer in this cabinet. So it was 3 voters and 5 members in total. Gantz and Eisenkot were 2. But Gantz and Eisenkot, who were both chiefs of staff of the military, in many ways, they represent the deep rot that's been inside the Israeli military establishment that has led to these false conceptions that ultimately resulted in October 7th attack in this war. And this actually gives Netanyahu a golden opportunity to take these left-wing and failed chiefs of staff out on their own volition. They've left the cabinet to replace them with some really qualified generals and former generals or other professionals that can strengthen the war cabinet and help guide Netanyahu and the IDF to a swift and decisive victory.
So does Netanyahu have the authority to go ahead and replace Gantz with whomever he wants?
Absolutely, he does. I mean, the creation of the war cabinet was something that Gantz that Gantz demanded in order to join and form a unity government with Netanyahu. You don't have to have a war cabinet in the government. The cabinet can function as a war cabinet. There's a security cabinet within the greater cabinet. Gantz had wanted a war cabinet so that he would have significant influence over the direction of the war. Now that he's leaving, Netanyahu is free to either scrap the war cabinet or to replace them on the war cabinet with whoever he wants.
Mm-hmm. Did he have a veto power in the war cabinet?
There were 3 votes inside the war cabinet. Netanyahu had a vote, and Gallant had a vote, and Gantz had a vote. It's not clear. Gantz didn't exactly have a veto, but obviously significant influence in a 3-member voting cabinet. It's not clear that Gallant always voted with Netanyahu. In many cases, we have indications that Gallant was siding with Gantz inside the cabinet. So the removal of Gantz can really free up Netanyahu to pursue the war in the ways in which he wants to do it, which may be against the advice of the U.S. administration, which has significant influence over the decision-making both of Gantz and also of Yoav Gallant.
Yeah, and what about does this threaten the coalition in any way?
It doesn't threaten the coalition. The coalition actually remains strong. These are the long-held allies of the prime minister. His right-wing government that was in power before the war remains in power. But what you are going to see very likely now is the return of the anti-government protest movement, which already had been starting protests. But now you should expect Gantz and Eisenkot to be out in front, leading the protests against the government. When Gantz resigned from the war cabinet, from the government, he called on Netanyahu to set a new election date. That's what he wants to see. see, and there are Israelis that want to see accountability, and they want a new election, but the government, Netanyahu, has still a strong 64-member coalition. So as long as they all want to remain in power and there's no indications that they're leaving, Netanyahu should be able to hang on to power long into his term, which is not scheduled to end until the end of 2026.
Is there a lot of, I guess, much ado about nothing is what Shakespeare said. We see it in the international press that all of a sudden, if Gantz leaves, that threatens the coalition. So are we seeing sort of a lot of hyperbole about what actually this means to the coalition government?
Well, it's wishful thinking, I think, on the part of the international press. They're hoping that this creates instability within the coalition. It's not going to damage the stability of the coalition. What it is going to do, potentially, is to harm the government's international standing, whereby opponents of Netanyahu's policies will be able to turn around and say, this is not a unity government. This is a narrow right-wing government filled with what they term as extremists. And then it will also give tailwind to the protest movement in Israel, which caused tremendous havoc in Israel this past summer, just months before October 7th, over Netanyahu and his coalition's proposed judicial reforms.
Yeah. And generally, would you say, like you said, most Israelis prefer not to go to elections, and they want to stand, at least for the duration of the war, behind Netanyahu and the way he's handling the war?
I'm not certain that all Israelis specifically want to stand behind Netanyahu as opposed to anybody else, but Netanyahu is the prime minister, and Israelis are fighting in Gaza, left and right, alongside each other, supporters of the prime minister, opponents of the prime minister, and they would have hoped that in this time of intense security crisis that the politicians would do the same, to put their political aspirations on the side and to unite and to fulfill this war as expeditiously as possible. Now it's clear that the politicians are not interested in that unity. And I do think that it harms the fabric here in Israel at a time when unity is needed. Yeah. And it will take a tremendous leadership on the part of Netanyahu to hold the country together at this time.
Yeah. How do many Israelis feel about Blinken, Biden, and the way that the U.S. has approached or maybe interfered with the government?
Well, you've seen a sliding scale here in the very beginning of the war. It seemed to most Israelis like the U.S. administration, the Biden administration, Antony Blinken were extremely supportive of the state of Israel. And with time, Israelis are learning more and more that the Biden administration has their own interests. Those interests don't align with the Israeli interests. They see what's going on in the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court at the United Nations. They understand that these things could not happen without the U.S. administration's tacit approval. And they see pressure on Israel at a time when they believe that they should have the full backing of their best friend and ally, the United States. And Israelis are growing increasingly disappointed.
Yeah. And what about today? I believe at the UN Security Council, the UN is going to propose their own resolution. Your thoughts about that?
I don't think it's going to have too much of an effect on Israeli policy. Israel's going to continue to fight this war in the way that they see fit, regardless of what the UN passes. However, other countries around the world that want there to be a ceasefire, that don't want Israel to defeat Hamas in the Gaza Strip, that don't want Israel to stop Hezbollah from its 8 months of attacking the Jewish state incessantly, they will turn to these UN resolutions. They will turn to these rulings by the International Court of Justice and the International Criminal Court, and they will use those as levers to ratchet up diplomatic pressure on Israel, which ultimately could result in sanctions against the Jewish state. So it is a scary moment for the state of Israel diplomatically, and the United States is not helping the state of Israel, and Israelis know that.
This resolution presumably calls for a two-state solution with the Palestinian Authority controlling both the West Bank and Gaza. What do most Israelis feel about a two-state solution?
This is the clearest question of all. Israelis are adamantly opposed to the creation of a Palestinian state at this time. The idea that a Palestinian state could be the result of the worst, most heinous, barbaric attack in the history of the modern Jewish state, this pogrom, which took place on October 7th, the murder of 1,200 people, the kidnapping of over 250, that action could then lead directly to the creation of a Palestinian state is abhorrent to most Israelis. And certainly the Israeli government and almost all Israelis believe that the Palestinian Authority is just one step removed from Hamas. They incentivize terror. They pay terrorists who are sitting in prisons. They pay families of individuals who were murdered who were neutralized rather or killed by the IDF while committing attacks of terror against Israelis. And they also know that if the Palestinian Authority takes over, there's a good chance that there will be an immediate reconciliation with Hamas so that Hamas will take over. So the Israelis are not comfortable with the idea of a Palestinian state, and they're not comfortable with the idea of the Palestinian Authority making any gains following October 7th.
Right. Any final thoughts, Alex?
Well, I think it's a complicated time. I do believe that if this war expands to the north against Hezbollah, which I think most Israelis recognize is going to happen, this is likely to reframe the conflict. Right now, people accuse Israel of an occupation against Palestinians. They think this is just the latest round of an intractable Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But if this battle expands in a major way into southern Lebanon, I think it will be easier for people to realize that Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis have all been attacking Israel and American targets, for that matter, since October 7th. And the connecting thread between those three terror organizations is the head of the terror octopus, the largest state sponsor of terrorism, Iran. This is not a war between Israel and Palestinians. This is a war between Israel, Iran, and its terror proxies in the region.
That people need to understand that. Alex Traiman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.